Welcome back. In this series, we take this worn out, extendable dining table and make it a fully functioning mobile workbench. But before we get started, we need this. That's right, this is a mobile shelf unit with a caster kit. It's a perfect solution for getting this extendable top onto a mobile frame. Come along as we show you how. So firstly, why a dining room table? Crazy idea, I know. Well, to start off with, it's quite handy because you have two different worktop sizes. You keep it closed up for when you're using it day to day, but when you're doing larger projects, you have the opportunity of opening it up. So in this case, which we won't be doing this time round because I don't need it this big, pull these leaves out, lock it all together, and all of a sudden you have a workbench which is twice as long as what you normally have, but it stores in the size of the normal workbench. It's really, really good and quite practical, but there are a few issues with it. Firstly, you can't move it. It is really, really annoying, and it feels like the legs are going to snap off as you're dragging along the concrete floor. Secondly, well, it looks like a dining room table, and that's not very good. Let's pack it back up, and I'll run you through a few of the initial ideas and get to this frame that we've ended up with. To assemble the base frame for this unit, we're using two 600 by 900 uprights for the two ends. You then want to get yourself 4 of the cross rails. In this case, we're using 900mm long units. I was looking at 1200mm, but the 900mm works quite well with the frame, which you'll see later. You want a bottom panel for your frame unit. In this case, we've elected to go with a mesh unit. You can also get a MDF base. We might change that later on. We just want to see how it's going to work. As we want this to be a mobile workbench, we've also bought a workbench caster kit, which goes onto the uprights, and it gives you everything you need to adapt the casters onto the bottom of the frame. We'll go into a time lapse now, and I'll show you how it all goes together. Now to fix the rail into the frame, there's 2 tabs on each rail, and they go into the triangular slots on the end of the rail. Now for the bottom rail, you want to make sure you keep the bottom slot free. That will allow for the mounting kit for the casters. Then it's simply a case of locating your slots and pushing down. And then you do the same on the other end. And then you insert the top rail, the same as the bottom rail, lining up with the triangular portions of the frame, and then pushing down. I like to get a soft face hammer, or in this case a rubber mallet, and you just want to tap these areas down to make sure they're securely locked in the frame. Okay, when it comes to put these casters on, they're a very, very tight fit. So what you need to do is put them on. I ended up punching each of the corners in over the top of the frame. It was the only way I could get them on. So you see that in the time lapse. Now what you do is there's an internal brace piece, triangular piece, with one hole on one end, 2 holes on the other end. You put it up so that the big hole is onto your caster, because there's a bolt, a large bolt that comes in the kit, and that goes through into the foot. So it comes in through the top here. You put your nut in from underneath. Obviously this is all upside down at the moment. Then there is another plate, and it locks in over the caster and goes onto the side of the frame. And you simply put these 2 smaller bolts through. And connect with the nuts on the other side. Now it's a very tight fit, so it's better to do it by hand or with a screwdriver, because you can't get a socket in from behind. So then I go in with the screwdriver and hand tighten it, and I will go back at the end and tighten it all up properly. But it's a case of these frames. They're not an accurately made unit, so you do have to finagle things a little bit to get it to all fit together. But generally it's been pretty good and everything seems to line up. And then to finish it off, I've got 4 of these shelf support brackets. Now they slot in to these mid rails and they allow support for your shelving when it goes in. So I'm going to put 2 of these on the bottom. I've got another 2 to go on the top. I'm actually going to flip them around a slightly different way for when we put the extra leaf from the table in, which we'll go through once we get into sorting the new top for this extension workbench. Now these are very, very easy. They just slot in. There's 2 little locating lugs on the bottom of each shelf, and they go into the corresponding hole here in the bottom of the rail. And the slots in the top allow them to poke through. Now from here, you just put your mesh or your MDF base in and the frame is essentially done. One other upgrade I will do is I'm going to put some Tek screws into the side of these rails, again just to hold it together a little bit better. The fixing pins that went in that I showed you at the start, they're fairly loose, so it's just to stop anything coming apart. We actually want to screw this together so it's more rigid and doesn't have so much flop in it when you move it around. So here's the assembled base to the workbench, all ready to go. One thing I have done is I've lowered this top rail down one slot because I want to put the additional leaf for the extension table in this zone once it all goes together. So I'll drop this down. Looking at it, that seems to be the best solution. However, we can modify that as we go. So noticing once I did the diagonal checks that the frame was out by a good 10 mil across the diagonals, I've had to tweak it slightly to get it square. It's now square. It's now square enough that we can use, but we will tighten it up again with some Tek screws in the corners and the framing that will come off this workbench once we pull it apart and start sliding it in back over the top. The next job is to pull all these stickers off, but all in all, it feels like a pretty strong, sturdy unit that will work quite well. And again, being a proprietary unit, it's good, it's off the shelf, you can modify it, there's additional accessories that you can put on these, and I think it will work quite well. One other thing to note is that once you come across to the existing table height, is that we gain a lot of height in this as well. I mean, obviously the table was far too low to start off with. You want a work height closer to a normal bench height, which is around about 900 mil. You'll find a normal dining table or a study desk or anything like that is around about 720 mil off the ground. Okay, now is to pull the top off this table to have a look at the workings of it and work out how we're going to swap the frame from here onto our new base here. Now, the initial plan was to reuse these tops and simply put new legs on the existing frame and mount some casters so you can move it around. But that's proving to be a little bit difficult. There's a few practical issues with the top that we need to address. So why can't you reuse this top? Well, I've been looking at this for quite some time. There's a few issues with reusing these tops. Firstly, they're a timber veneer, so they do have a tendency to delaminate and get marked. They're quite hard to, it really needs to be refinished, to be honest, to work properly. You'll also notice the leaves inside haven't been used as much and exposed to the elements, so they're actually a different colour in themselves. Look, that's not a big issue for a workbench, but ideally I want to square this up. And the big issue with these tops, that is meaning that we probably will go to a new work surface, is that they actually taper from the middle to the end via this curve. I was hoping you'd be able to just chop off the curve and sort of straighten it all up, but you just lose too much of this worktop to make it viable to do. So I've been looking at different options. There's a lot of different options you can do for worktops. Firstly is a solid timber top. That's probably not too bad, but in a big format like this, that's quite a heavy workbench to be wheeling around a workshop. My original idea was to cover these tops and infill and pack out and strengthen the sides, cutting off this the fancy profile you get on a dining room table with a furniture linoleum. So my thinking there was that it's reasonably self-healing and it's soft, so it takes a little bit of impact and wear and tear. There's a few problems with doing that, particularly with the leaves, is how you get all that mechanism to work. I also looked at, can you cover it with some other material? A lot of people do use a hardboard, a tempered hardboard, or what we call masonite over here in Australia. So you put that on the top as a sacrificial topping to the table that you can pull off and replace from time to time. But again, I have the issue with these leaves in that when they fold and sandwich together, I haven't got the room for these to clamp back together. So you would be having to modify all the hinging and mechanisms to do that if you wanted to keep it as a folding leaf like this. The other issue with the folding leaves is that they clash with the framework and structure underneath. So as it is currently, I've lived with it. We sometimes have some mobile toolboxes under here and it's not too bad, but looking at putting it on the frame, I've found at the moment that it's likely to clash with the framing of that particular frame. So while it's nice to have these hinging back in, I can't see why we can't reuse the aluminium extrusions and the mechanisms for the main leaves and just have another extension leaf which sits down inside in one full piece. Then we don't have to worry about the joint through the middle either. To me, that just makes sense, and I think it's a much more practical way of dealing with it, and has allowed me to come to a solution in regards to the top type and how we go about doing it. So what are we going to do? We're going to pull these tops off and remove the leaves and the hinging mechanism that goes with them. We're then going to make brand new tops using form ply. So we'll have one sheet of form ply over the top, and we'll thicken it on the edges with a second sheet underneath on the outside of the frame. That will allow for more clamping. We're putting things like vices and stuff in, and it'll just make it a lot more sturdy without adding too much weight. We will then modify the existing frame that this table is made from, removing the legs obviously and the ends, and get that to slot in over the top of the mobile frame that we've just assembled. One thing that we need to be conscious of is you don't want to put a vice on the end, on either end of this, unless maybe we do an underslung vice, which I'd like to have rather than a top mounted vice. You just don't want to have all the weight on the end, because once these leaves come out, they're technically cantilevering off these aluminium extrusions. But we'll take all this apart and we'll have a look at it and see what we can do. Okay, looks a little bit gruesome. However, this is the table transferred onto our frame. And as you can see, it's all pretty close, which is why I decided to go down this route. The side rails of the table pretty much fit onto the side of the frame. So we'll remove these legs, obviously. We'll take off these ends, shorten the long rail down so it fits snugly within the new steel frame, and we'll probably put a new cross rail here to tie in the timber structure. Now, I've been always interested in how these extrusions work and the sliding mechanisms, but it's simply just a lip which slides in a groove sawn in the timber. So it's very rudimentary and easy, but it does glide really, really nicely. You'll notice that I had to break off some packers they had glued on at the fixing points, so I might need to look at doing that for the new top, but otherwise it's a very, very simple setup. Okay, we've got a lot done in an afternoon. I'm really, really excited about this project. I think it's going to be fantastic. Stay tuned for next episode, where we'll start working together the nuts and bolts, modifying this timber frame to bolt onto our new steel frame, and making the tops. Stay tuned, we'll be back soon.